Hi, and welcome back. We're looking at the APU Loudness Compressor today. It's a sponsored video, don't expect an impartial review. But it's a rather unusual compressor with many powerful features, and which can also give us some insights into compression more generally. So let's watch the Loudness Compressor ride my voiceover levels, while I make a couple of general observations about compressors. Chances are that you were first introduced to the concept of compression as automatic volume control. That was the original intention, after all. Compression was supposed to automate the task of riding a fader and control the loudness more consistently than a human being. The thing is, traditional compressors totally suck at controlling loudness. Yes, they can reduce the dynamic range, but they rarely respond to loudness in the way that humans perceive it, and they all either significantly change the sound of the audio they're processing, or react too slowly, or some combination of both. And that's of course the reason we still use them today, despite all being able to automate levels instead. We use them precisely because they change the sound in ways that we find subjectively pleasing. But we still find ourselves with the need to control loudness in a more automatic way than in fader automation. So enter the APU Loudness Compressor. This takes advantage of two important modern innovations to solve the problems that vintage designs failed at. The sidechain level detection can use modern loudness units, as defined in the APU R128 specifications. This is the best measure we have currently of human loudness perception, though it's important to remember that human loudness perception is very complex, and it is still just an approximation. Hence all those "why does my mix sound quiet on Spotify" posts. And the other modern innovation is automatic plug-in delay compensation, so plugins can perform the impossible and see into the future, at the expense of some latency. And the loudness compressor can use slow and gentle loudness detection without also reacting too late. Before we get into the details, however, time for my second compression insight. Let's talk about the strange way we categorise compressors, mostly by the gain reduction method, so FET, VCA, vary mu and so on. This puts an SSL-style bus compressor in the same VCA category as a DBX 160, which is kind of silly really, they don't sound remotely the same. Arguably, most of the character of a compressor comes from the sidechain. This will include some kind of envelope following, some way to define the transfer curve, threshold ratio knee and so on, some kind of attack and release smoothing, and possibly some kind of pre-filtering for the sidechain signal. Each of these stages can vary subtly or dramatically in different compressor designs, and each probably has a more significant effect on the sound than the gain stage they're controlling. So the SSL bus compressor follows peak levels from the output of the VCA, giving a feedback design, while the DBX uses RMS input levels for a feed-forward design, and they sound nothing like one another, despite them both using a VCA for the actual gain stage. The usual categories make even less sense when you recognise that, in digital audio, a variable gain stage is just a multiplication. Implementing an automatically controllable analog gain stage was a significant challenge that was addressed in a wide variety of ways, from optocells and light bulbs, to tubes with variable mu control, to FETs and VCAs. But a digital gain stage is just a multiply in the code. Unless the developer specifically tries to emulate the quirks and nonlinearities of an analog gain control method, the usual compressor categories don't really apply at all. The loudness compressor doesn't emulate any analog gain stage. The gain control is a pure digital multiplication. But it gives us an unusual degree of control over the sidechain, which is much more important. We can choose between different types of envelope follower, like true peak, or RMS, or short-term loudness. We can define the transfer curve in novel and unusual ways, or with more traditional threshold and ratio controls. We have a choice of two different types of attack and release smoothing, which we can use together or separately. Altogether, this makes for some extremely powerful dynamics options. Let's demonstrate with some 808 drums. Here's a momentary setting, which is controlling the overall loudness without really changing the character of the sound at all, as you can hear when I toggle bypass. Now I'm going to switch to memory B. That's a pretty wild difference, right? In fact, all I'm really changing is the level detection method from momentary loudness to true peak. I'm using the memory switching because when I do that, I also need to turn the lookahead right down and dial in more makeup gain. But the difference in sound is entirely due to the different level detection method used in the sidechain. Clearly then, this compressor is capable of a lot more than just transparent loudness control, as its name might suggest. But loudness control is probably its biggest USP, so let's start there. The default settings put you a couple of clicks away from levelling something like a voice. The loudness type at the top is set to LUFS momentary, which is the fastest of the loudness measurements defined by the R128 standard, and can react quickly enough to catch loud syllables in a voiceover. This setting averages the loudness over a 400 millisecond window, which is very long in usual compressor terms. So in order to not react too late, we also have a default 200 milliseconds lookahead setting at the bottom. That's half the window size, so you can think of the compressor as averaging out the signal level for 200 milliseconds either side of now. And rather than conventional threshold and ratio controls, we get to choose a source range and a target range. The source range sliders define the quietest and loudest parts of the input signal that we're concerned with. You can easily see how these relate to the input signal levels on the left panel of the visualization above. If you turn on the Learn feature and play a representative sample of quiet and loud sections, these will be set automatically. You can then set the target range either by choosing a preset or by dragging the sliders, and those input levels will be mapped to new output levels. If the target range is smaller than the source range, you'll be compressing the signal. If I match the lower target slider to the source and set the upper target slider lower, this is like compression without any makeup gain, where that lower source slider represents the threshold. But if I slide both targets higher, this is now compression with makeup gain. A quick side note, the target range presets specify an integrated loudness value, suggesting that your processed audio should end up at that target integrated loudness. Actually, that's not guaranteed. You should be in the right ballpark, but perfectly matching that integrated loudness would require offline analysis of the entire audio file, which a plugin like this can't do. There is, however, an offline tool available from the same developer, the Dynamics Optimizer, which can do all that kind of stuff. And I gather there are plans to create an ARA plugin version of this in the future. Anyway, with the default settings, sliding both targets like this has exactly the same effect as adjusting the output gain knob at the bottom right. But we can change that via this setting menu. Low-level type defines what happens to signals below the source range. If I set this to bypass, those low-level signals won't be processed at all. And if I choose gate, they'll be muted. Use that last one with care. While we're discussing settings, note that there's a choice of different lookahead modes. The default offset literally just applies a negative delay to the sidechain, so both the attack and release stages will, in effect, move earlier when you increase the setting. This might be the optimum mode for this kind of levelling, but it's not standard compressor lookahead behaviour. Most compressors with a lookahead only move the attack stage earlier, while preserving the release timing. If you want that more conventional behaviour, pick the peak lookahead instead. And this slider now only affects the attack stage. You can also set it to use the average of the lookahead window. This is a new one to me. I'll need to live with it for a while to form an opinion as to when it's appropriate. And also there's a floor setting. This one is like the inverse of the peak setting in that it leaves the attack stage alone and moves the release earlier. This is a very unusual option. I can't currently think of any practical examples for it. Just know that this lookahead mode only affects the release, and unless you have a specific reason to want to do that, you should probably skip it. I mentioned earlier that the default 200 millisecond lookahead was chosen to be half the default 400 millisecond momentary loudness detection. This doesn't have to be so precise, however. I find I can go as low as about 100 without breaking the levelling too badly. What if you choose the slower, short-term loudness detection, however? This uses a much longer 3-second window and will respond to loud phrases of speech rather than loud syllables. The maximum look-ahead available is 400 milliseconds, not even close to halfway through that window. 2 points. Actually, 400 milliseconds might be enough anyway. But if it isn't, you can increase the maximum available. Not all DAWs are happy with plugins that continually update their reported latency, so this look-ahead parameter in the compressor tab doesn't change that. Instead, there's a reserved latency parameter called budget in the settings tab. This sets the amount of latency reported by the plugin, and therefore the maximum amount of look-ahead available. And in order not to overly confuse those fussier DAWs, the change won't take effect until you apply it. Note, however, if you set a very high value here, the latency might start to get annoying, especially if it stacks up with other non-real-time plugins in the chain. So if you don't need that much, you can turn it down instead. 200 milliseconds will be enough for most momentary loudness riding. And if I apply that, we now have half the latency that we had with default settings. You can go further and almost remove the latency entirely. This is best saved for the RMS and peak compression types, however, which I'll get to shortly. First, let's talk about attack and release smoothing. I used the word smoothing deliberately because that's typically how it works. You take the fast-moving signal from the level detector and smooth out the spikes, slow down the changes. Essentially, it's just a type of low-pass filtering. If you're using loudness detection, which is already very smooth and slow to react, there aren't going to be any fast spikes to smooth out anyway, and these attack and release controls at the bottom left won't make much of any difference at all until they get above about halfway up with the momentary setting. And if you're using short-term loudness, you'll need them even higher before you notice any changes. These settings are consequently way less significant than with conventional compression, and if you're doing this type of loudness compression, you might not really need to worry about them at all. Don't worry, I'll be revisiting these settings with the peak detection before the end of the video, and that's a very different story. We're not done yet though, as we have another dramatically different type of smoothing available. Let's switch to linear rate fixed, which deactivates the conventional smoothing controls and replaces them with these, calibrated in dB per second. Why not milliseconds like we're used to? Well, although it's conventional to set attack and release as timings, the numbers never really mean very much. It's a measure of time until an arbitrary proportion of the gain reduction has happened, or stopped happening, and there's no standard way to measure it. In reality, what we're controlling is the rate of gain change. So arguably, calibrating in dB per second or dB per millisecond would make more sense. But with most normal compressors, the rate of gain change isn't constant. A louder transient will trigger a faster response than a quieter one. The gain change will usually start fast, then slow down as it approaches its target. And any kind of program dependency to the attack and release will mean that there still isn't one accurate figure that you can put on the rate. Except, with this linear rate smoothing, none of that applies. This is the least program-dependent a compressor can be, while also, incidentally, being the most accurate possible way to calibrate attack and release parameters. When the gain is reducing, it will always happen at the rate defined by the attack knob, and when the gain is increasing, it will always happen at the rate defined by the release knob, regardless of any other properties of the signal. This means two things. Turning these knobs up makes the attack or release faster, not slower, like in 1176. And the resulting gain changes are linear. I know that yet another use of the term linear is possibly confusing, so let's show why it's called that, using automation as an approximate example. Here's a snare drum hit. And here's some automation to represent how a conventional compressor might respond to that. The gain will drop down very fast to begin with, then slow down with a curve. And likewise, the release will start fast and then tail off more gradually. If the snare drum gets louder, the compressor will react more aggressively to it. The gain change will be faster to start with, so that it can reach a higher gain reduction amount. Now consider linear smoothing. That means a constant rate of change in decibels, so both the attack and release stages will be perfectly straight. No sexy curves this time. And if the snare drum gets louder, that downwards section can't get any steeper, so this design can't react any more aggressively to it. It will be targeting a higher gain reduction value, but it won't have time to get there before the input signal starts to drop in level and the compressor switches to the release stage. In a levelling context, this can be quite useful. You can rein in the momentary smoothing and stop it pumping too quickly if needed. Or you can make the short-term smoothing super smooth and indetectable, with constant linear gain changes such as you might get by drawing in automation manually. If you're really hardcore, you can use both types of smoothing together. I think the best way to think of this is as normal attack and release smoothing, but with a hard speed limit set by the linear rate controls. Anyway, I've been demoing this on my voice so far, and I do think this plugin is likely to be most popular with people working in broadcast or similar, where the delivery specs include a loudness range. But that doesn't mean we can't find uses for loudness compression in music production. Not all musicians are equally good at controlling their playing dynamics, after all. I can think of no better way to demonstrate that than to attempt to play a bass guitar part. If I compress the loudness of the raw DI signal before it hits nonlinearities like the amp sim or conventional compression, I can make it feel like I played with consistent dynamics, as if I were actually good at playing bass. I probably don't need to elaborate on that too much, right? Any situation where the performance dynamics are a bit out of control, some loudness compression might save you a ton of tedious automation. Awesome. But the musical uses really explode, quite literally, when you switch the detector type. Let's go back to those drums and choose a peak detector. Notice we have a choice of true or sample peaks. True peak detection is more important in limiters, really, so they can avoid creating intersample peaks. In this case, maybe it sounds better with some settings, or maybe I'm just imagining it. I don't want the Lookahead in this case, and because I know that for sure, I'm going to visit the settings page, turn down that reserved latency budget all the way, and hit apply, because it's always nicer to work with less latency if you have the option. And you'll notice the Lookahead slider has now vanished from the compressor interface. And in this context, I think I'll be happier with more conventional threshold and ratio type controls, so let's switch to the downward compression mode instead. And let's also visit this visualization settings menu. There are lots of options here which I'm not going to cover in this video, mostly because I think the defaults are well chosen and show you exactly what you need to see. So all I'm going to do is enable the transfer curve graph, so it's easier to see what's going on. Now let's dial in a moderate ratio and a suitable threshold, and then make up that gain. And notice how important those attack and release controls have suddenly become. The attack can be thumpy, or really tight and snappy. The release can be slow and groovy, or super fast and in your face. Both attack and release controls can go right to 0. And we're in full-on distortion territory now. This brutally smashes off the peaks of the signal with no attempt to smooth the gain reduction or preserve the shape of the waveform in any way. This isn't quite wave shaping, however, as there's a whole buffer size issue that we've yet to discuss. You'll notice there's a kind of ring modulation effect going on, as well as the distortion, right? That's because the processing actually happens in chunks rather than continuously. And if we switch back to that settings tab, we can change the size of those chunks with the block size parameter. If I reduce the block size, then apply that setting, the ring modulation gets higher in pitch. If I increase it, things start to get kind of grainy. Let's reset the block size to default, then dial in some more normal attack and release settings. Let's go for a tight and snappy attack and a pretty fast release. Personally, I would have expected this type of setting to be dramatically affected by the block size parameter. Actually, if I switch between the default 1 millisecond and the smallest 0.1 millisecond options, the difference is surprisingly subtle. There's a much bigger difference when it comes to CPU use, however. Reaper's reported CPU use roughly doubles with the smallest block size, though it still plays back in real time on my system with no difficulty. I should probably explain the offline HD option over to the right at this point. You might assume, as I initially did, that this means oversampling, but you would be wrong. In fact, this allows you to use a smaller block size for rendering than for real-time playback. This is an offline-only option because the CPU use increases dramatically, and you'll get much slower renders, especially with the 4x option. So now we've covered the oversampling that's not really oversampling, let's hop back to the compressor tab and talk about the dither that's not really dither. We have a ballistics type menu in these settings with 4 different options: natural or inertial, and dithered or direct. Dither doesn't mean the type of dither you add when you reduce the bit depth of your signal. You'll still need to do that however you were before. This is entirely different. It means small random variations for the compressor delta, which isn't continuous due to that block size thing we just discussed. I've confirmed with a null test that this does seem to do what it claims, but so far I've been totally unable to hear any difference as a result. Perhaps I just don't know what to listen for. Your mileage may vary. But the other option is clearly audible to me. The natural ballistics sound rounder and fatter, while the inertial ballistics are snappier and spikier. That's definitely a useful difference. If we go back to the attack and release knobs, notice that you can change the units used. You can set the attack in samples instead of milliseconds if you want, though I can't imagine why you would. Perhaps more useful is the option to use a percentage of the lookahead time. I've not seen that option anywhere else, but it seems like a good idea. We also have the option to use BPM synced beats, which will use the host tempo by default, although you can set a manual tempo in the settings tab if you need to. This is usually only going to be relevant for the release when you're compressing, and we have hilariously comprehensive control. The second knob here sets the beat division, so 16th notes by default, and the first sets the number of those beats, so I could set this to 4 for quarter notes, or I could reset the numerator to 1 and set the denominator to 4 and get an identical quarter note setting. I'll be honest, I'm generally a skeptic when it comes to BPM synced compressor times. It's not like a delay time, which can be perfectly matched to the song tempo. It's the time until an arbitrary point on a curve, and you're always going to have to tune it by ear anyway. But it does mean that you can create a preset that bumps in a specific way with a BPM synced release time, and expect that preset to behave in the same way in a different project with a different tempo. Okay, now I need to reveal that these attack and release parameters have been lying to you all along. They don't really control attack and release. In fact, the attack time controls the rate at which the gain is reduced by the processing, while the release time controls the rate at which the gain is increased. With compression, that's a distinction without a difference. The attack stage will always mean the gain reducing and vice versa. But notice what happens if I switch to expansion instead. I'll need to turn the ratio knob down in this mode for it to start working. And let's try those attack and release controls again. The attack still controls how quickly the gain is reduced, but that now means what we would normally call the release. And the release knob now affects what we would normally call attack. It's probably important to know about that. Also note that if I choose the soft limiting, this is much like the downward compression setting, just with a higher ratio. Unlike the downwards compression, the knee is only as soft as you make it with the knee control, so this can also be hard limiting if you want it. While we've got the limiting up, remember those alternative linear attack and release controls? Yeah, we've got those as well. Or instead. However, there is a reason that most compressors don't work this way. I find this type of compression is good for two main scenarios. When you want very slow and gradual gain changes, such as you might when just transparently controlling loudness, or when you want to smash things brutally fast. That can be quite a cool sound that you may want to try on your drum room mics. And incidentally, if I did that, I would probably also unlink the channels for dual mono compression. In between, however, things get a bit lumpier and more difficult. Program dependency is generally considered a good thing for compression, and as I explained earlier, I think this is the least program dependent that a compressor can possibly be. It makes attack times especially difficult to dial in. Yes, you can get extra snap or punch on a drum, but tiny changes to the setting will tend to have a dramatic effect on the sound, making it very difficult to dial in appropriately. And the resulting added punch can tend to be very inconsistent if the dynamics or velocity vary at all. And likewise, the release tends to go suddenly from too fast to too slow, with only a tiny sweet spot in between. And it's important to note, if a compressor releases quickly to start with, then slows down as it approaches its target, that means most of the distortion from the gain modulation happens shortly after the transient that triggered it, which helps to mask that distortion psychoacoustically and make it less noticeable. There's none of that with the linear smoothing. The rate of gain change remains constant throughout the release stage, so the distortion is also constant. So feel free to experiment with the linear smoothing when you want unusually audible and noticeable compression. But for the usual punch or groove or glue type duties, you're better off with the more conventional attack and release controls. And no, we still haven't finished. We haven't talked about RMS detection yet. This isn't really just one option, rather a whole range, due to the RMS window size control that appears over to the right. You can think of this as spanning that huge chasm between the super gentle loudness compression and the potentially super aggressive peak compression. RMS is a type of averaging, not too dissimilar to the way loudness units are calculated. You can think of LUFS as a refinement and development of RMS. When indeed, before loudness units were standardised, RMS was considered the best way to measure the loudness of your audio. But we don't have standardised window sizes like we do for loudness units, and you're free to dial in whatever window size you like. If you set this to 400 milliseconds, it will behave in a very similar way to the momentary loudness detection, which also uses a 400 millisecond window. But I think things get more interesting with much smaller window sizes. The smaller it gets, the faster and bouncier its response will be, and the closer it gets to peak detection. Mathematically, if the window size gets down to a single sample, it will be identical to the peak values. So this 0.1 millisecond minimum setting is pretty close, just a slightly rounder and less spiky version of the peak detection. If we go up to about 3 milliseconds, that's now very different on drums. Listen to the difference when I switch to peak detection and back. The peak detection is kind of hard and aggressive and snappy. while that little 3 millisecond RMS window gives it a much softer, more pillowy kind of punch. If we go up to 30 milliseconds, different again. There's a poppy, punchy attack now. This is kind of a strong flavour on drums, but sometimes a little touch of this kind of setting can be more appropriate than FET-style snap. Actually, I found this kind of setting worked well on my bass guitar part. So yes, I ended up with 2 instances of the loudness compressor on my bass. One processing the raw DI with momentary loudness detection and lookahead, and the other processing the mixed signal blended with an amp sim using a 30 millisecond RMS window. So, I'm going to wrap things up there. I hope you'll agree that this is an unusually powerful and interesting plugin, with many possible creative uses beyond its headline loudness compression. For example, here's those drums again, with some brutal fast peak compression dialed in using the source to target paradigm, with the low-level type set to gate, so chopping out anything below the source range. There's a dry-wet mix knob if you want just a little taste of the madness. Or if you really want to push the envelope, why not patch an EQ to the external sidechain input? Final point. Some of you may have noticed that these sponsored videos lack the kind of sarcastic criticism that sometimes pops up in my independent reviews, and may have concluded that the developer has simply paid for a positive video. Being completely honest, there may be a little bit of truth to that. But much more importantly, if the developer is my client, I will raise any such issues directly with them before writing it into my script. And often those issues are gone by the time I'm actually making the video. That was very much the case here. The developer has been extremely responsive to my feedback, with fixes typically coming just hours after my reports, and many small refinements and improvements, making this a much more powerful and polished plugin than the first version I tried. And there's really nothing left for me to be sarcastic about. Okay, maybe just one thing. Don't switch out of dark mode unless you're wearing sunglasses. Speaking of the interface, there's a whole tab dedicated to customizing the colour scheme. There are alternative presets to choose from, or you can manually dial in something horrific if you want. Personally, I think the defaults are well chosen, and I'll be sticking with those. More importantly, this interface is freely resizable, so you'll be able to work with it whatever type of display you're using. Okay, that's all. Thanks for watching.